Hello and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the strange and forgotten parts of Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and in this very special episode, we're going to talk about Christmas. By definition, there was no Christmas in Ireland before Christianity. However, there does seem to have been some significance to the midwinter season among the ancient Irish. In fact, one of Ireland's oldest structures is dedicated to the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, which usually falls around 21st of December. And speaking of Newgrange, of course, Ireland's most famous prehistoric monument. Newgrange was built around 3100 BC, which makes it as old as Stonehenge, and 500 years older than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. It's a lot less sophisticated than the Great Pyramid, though. It's a cairn. At the most basic level, just a pile of rocks. 200,000 tons of rocks, to be precise, taken from the nearby River Boyne and piled up in a circular mound, with a passage leading inwards to a chamber at the centre. Not all of the stones come from the river, though. The passage and the chamber are lined with sandstone slabs taken from the local area, and the entrance and outer facade of the building are made of stones from further afield. Most noticeable is the bright white quartz, taken from the Wicklow Mountains to the south, and the dark cobblestones from the Mourne Mountains to the north. Newgrange is one of three great prehistoric mounds in the area, along with one called Nouth and another called Douth. Both Nouth and Douth are passage tombs. Newgrange is a little more mysterious. It might have been built as a tomb and then co-opted as a religious site, or built as a site for rituals and then temporarily used as a burial site. Deposits of bone have been found in its passages, along with what might have been grave goods. The site has been well known over the millennia, though, so it's probably been pretty thoroughly looted. Part of why it has remained in active use is because of its most famous property, which is what ties it to the winter solstice. On the morning of the shortest day of the year, the sun rises late in Ireland, around 40 minutes after 8 a.m. in fact. As that sun rises, its light shines directly down the passage of Newgrange, through a special opening above the main entrance. This allows the sunbeam to reach the central chamber and illuminate it, bringing light to the darkness. Newgrange is not the only tomb aligned with the sunrise like this, but it is unusual in being designed specifically to use the light in this way. This made it a site of much wonder over the centuries, as its original construction faded into myths and legends. One of those facts that helps me keep history in perspective is this. The Celts arrived in Ireland in 500 BC, 2.5 millennia ago. That was a long time ago, but the building of Newgrange was over twice as far back as that. It was older to them than they are to us. No wonder they called this mysterious mound Sheen Abrú, the Palace of the Fairies. It was associated with the Dagda, the good god, the old god who harkens back to prehistoric times with his crude loincloth and his club, with a brutish experience that stands in contrast to his bottomless wisdom. Celts and others may have made changes to the site. Circle of stones around it seems to be a later addition, for example. Christianity made Newgrange much more obscure, and by the medieval era it was mostly forgotten. By this time it had taken on its modern name, as a 14th century manuscript refers to the area as Nova Grangia. A grange was an old word for a farm that was owned by a monastery or lord, but isolated away from their other holdings. In 1699 the tomb was rediscovered and became of great interest to scholars. As the extent of the tomb became clear, many of them immediately began to doubt that it could have been built by the native Irish. This was based on no evidence aside from their own racial prejudice, but it was confidently stated that it must have been built by Vikings, or even visiting Egyptian traders. The first serious study of the site took place in the 1960s, under the supervision of Professor Michael J. O'Kelly. He took a thorough survey and verified the local stories of light shining down the passage at midwinter. Controversially, he also excavated and reconstructed the tomb to attempt to recreate its original appearance. Based on legends of it gleaming white, he uncovered and rebuilt the white quartz facade of the tomb. How authentic this reconstruction was has been the subject of fierce debate, but it definitely lends Newgrange a unique and striking appearance, very different from the stark greyness of most prehistoric monuments. Nowadays, Newgrange sits at the centre of a modern Irish tradition, a gathering in its central chamber each year to see the solstice sunrise shine in and light it up. Only a dozen people each day are allowed in the chamber during the 5 days that the sunrise shines down the passage. The attendees are chosen by random drawing from the tens of thousands who apply. Regular visitors are treated to a recreation of the effect using electric lights. And it is awe-inspiring to think of how over 5,000 years ago light first struck the same stones for the first time, and of the number of solstices since then. St. Patrick brought Christianity and Christmas to Ireland in 448 AD, but even then, the early Celtic Christians don't seem to have embraced its celebrations in the same way as their continental cousins. For the Roman Church, Saturnalia flowed into Christmas, but for the Celts it was Imbolc, the first day of spring, that they celebrated. This became St. Bridget's Day under the Christians. In fact, the first real Christmas celebrations recorded in Ireland involved an English king, Henry II, who spent Christmas in Dublin in 1171 AD. Henry was named for his grandfather, a man whose death had thrown England into chaos 36 years earlier. After Henry I's only son died on a sinking ship, he planned to leave the throne to his daughter Matilda, mother of Henry II. When Henry I died, his nephew Stephen broke his oaths and seized the throne with the aid of a misogynistic court. 15 years of brutal civil war resulted that ended in a treaty. Stephen would keep the throne, but Matilda's son Henry would be his heir. Henry II inherited a throne with a shaky foundation and spent many years shoring it up. Part of this involved reasserting the crown's supremacy over the church, which brought him into conflict with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas à Becket. After a particularly bitter dispute in 1170, some angry remarks by Henry were interpreted by 4 of his knights as an order to kill the Archbishop. This they did, murdering him in Canterbury Cathedral. Killing a man of God in the house of God was naturally a bit controversial. While Henry tried to argue that the knights had misinterpreted him, his enemies on the continent seized the matter, and he was excommunicated. Because he was excommunicated, he couldn't officially take part in church ceremonies. Luckily for him, in 1171 he was in Ireland, reasserting control over the Norman lords there. Richard de Clare, also known as Strongbow, had invaded Ireland in 1167 as a mercenary for Diarmait mac Murchada, with Henry's approval. When Diarmait died in 1171, Strongbow claimed Leinster for himself, but he was in a risky position. Henry brought a large army over to Ireland to support his vassal, and to remind him that he was still under the control of the English crown. Although Henry could have returned to England, he decided to stay in Dublin for Christmas, to celebrate out of the direct sight of the Roman Church. Henry was determined to make his Christmas as much a projection of his power as his army had been. He had a palace built to host it outside the city. Well outside the city back then. Nowadays Dame Street, one of Dublin's major thoroughfares, runs over the site. He invited many of the lords and petty kings of Ireland to come to the feast. Gerald of Wales, a historian who came into the king's service 13 years later, wrote that the Irish were, quote, much astonished at the sumptuousness of his entertainments and the splendour of his household. Gerald is not generally reliable in the Irish, who he regarded as savages, but he is probably accurate here. Henry had been raised on the continent in the French court of Anjou, and he brought those traditions with him. The celebrations ran right through from December to February. One of the highlights was Henry formally granting a charter to the city of Dublin. Interestingly, the charter granted the inhabitants of Bristol in England the right to freely settle in Dublin, recognising the strong trading link between the two cities at the time. Henry finally left Ireland on Easter Sunday 1172. It would be another 13 years before another English king, his son John, visited Ireland. In fact, throughout the 12th, 13th and 14th century, the rulers of England would visit Ireland only 5 times in total. Henry might have been gone, but the Christmas traditions he brought took root and flourished. One example of a Christmas tradition allegedly took place in Dublin in 1458. Ada Peter describes it in her 1907 book, Sketches of Old Dublin, although there are some inconsistencies in her account. She says that a series of mystery plays were put on, with the Lord Deputy of Ireland, the Earl of Ossory, in attendance. The only problem is that there was no earldom of Ossory until 1528, and the only Earl who was Lord Deputy of Ireland was James Butler, who served from 1662 to 1668. She also says that Ireland Usher was the Lord Mayor of Dublin at the time, but he wouldn't become mayor until 1469. Given that, her account of the plays being held in College Green are a little untrustworthy, but it's believable that they did actually happen at some point. It was a common English tradition at the time for craftsmen's guilds to put on religious plays, either at Christmas or around the feast of Corpus Christi in June. The upper and middle class in Dublin at the time were firmly culturally English, so it's very plausible they wanted to be part of this tradition. Mystery plays were banned by the Anglican Church under Queen Elizabeth for being too Catholic in nature. Around the end of the 19th century, scholars rediscovered them. By 1907, when Ada Peters was writing, reenactments were being put on based on manuscripts in private collections. So it's equally likely that she just wanted to make Dublin a part of a trendy historical tradition. Christmas of 1591 saw one of Ireland's most dramatic prison breaks, as Red Hugh O'Donnell made a bid for his freedom. Hugh was the heir to the throne of Ciaran, an old Irish kingdom that covered modern Donegal and Leitrim. At the age of 14, he was kidnapped by English agents, to be used as a hostage to ensure his father's loyalty. He spent 4 years imprisoned in Dublin Castle, making his first escape attempt in January of 1591. He was recaptured as he fled over the Wicklow Mountains and imprisoned in Dublin Castle again. In December of 1591, a second plan was hatched. Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone and father of Red Hugh's fiancée, bribed the guards and smuggled in a rope. Red Hugh escaped along with 2 other prisoners, both members of the O'Neill family. Out in the city, he and one of the others, Art McShane O'Neill, met up with a guide named Edward Eustace. They fled into the Wicklow Mountains again, but the winter weather was too much for the escapees, and they had to shelter in a cave while Eustace went for help. He returned with aid, but not before Art died from the cold. Red Hugh O'Donnell survived and spent the rest of his life in rebellion against the English crown. He went on to become a symbol of Irish resistance for centuries to come. In 1689, for the second and last time in Irish history, an English king spent his Christmas in Dublin. This time it was James II, ill-fated son of an ill-fated father. That father was Charles I, who had been executed by a rebellious parliament 20 years earlier. His throne had been reclaimed by his eldest son, also named Charles, who was James's brother. Charles II had 10 illegitimate children, but no legitimate ones. So when he died suddenly at the age of 54, his brother James was thrust onto the throne. James was deeply unpopular, mostly because he was a Catholic. In fact, a law excluding Catholics from inheriting the throne, aimed specifically at him, was proposed by Parliament but blocked by his brother. His unpopularity led to a rebellion on behalf of Charles II's illegitimate son, James of Monmouth, which failed. King James then faced a second rebellion on behalf of his daughter Mary, which succeeded. This rebellion put Mary on the throne of England, with her husband William of Orange as co-monarch. James fled to Ireland, where the Irish Parliament declared him as the true king and the English Parliament as traitors. Unlike Henry II, James was probably not disposed to make his Christmas a spectacle, and there are no accounts of it preserved. He would not get to celebrate a second. In the summer of 1690, William's forces routed his in the Battle of the Boyne, near the site of Newgrange. The ancient graveyard of the Boyne Valley had a new harvest of corpses, and among them were the hopes of the Stuart monarchy. James fled to France, and he would never return to Ireland or England ever again. As mass media came to Ireland, we start to get accounts of what Christmas was like for normal families. One such account was published in the Dublin and London magazine in 1825. The article was written by Monsignor Stafford. Monsignor is an honorary title in the Catholic Church, granted by the Pope to priests who have distinguished themselves in some way. It's basically the religious version of a knighthood. As has been traditional throughout human history, the article is a lament for how things were back in the good old days, when the author was young. His father was a prominent local farmer in the town of Rathangan in Wexford, rich enough to send his son off to boarding school. Christmas was something the boy and his friends looked forward to eagerly then, as it was a chance to escape from the academy and back onto the farm. Christmas was a time to be with his family, from his 80-year-old grandmother to his sister Betsy. He arrived home on Christmas Eve to a bustle of preparation, and was expected to immediately pitch in and help out. The good pewter dishes were out for Christmas, and Stafford mentions chopping hemlock to polish them. I've never heard of doing this, and using a poisonous herb to clean plates made of a lead compound seems like adding insult to injury. Still, he's the one who was there. Other chores he mentions, like corralling the pigs and scattering sand on the kitchen floor, are a bit more familiar. As darkness fell, the chores were done, and the family gathered in companionable comfort by the fire, until the time came to get ready for midnight mass. That mass took place at a thatched chapel, with a wooden cross on the roof. This was only a few years after the laws had relaxed enough to allow open practice of Catholicism in Ireland. Although in a footnote, Monsignor Stafford mentions that Rathangan was so isolated that he never even heard of the penal laws against Catholics until he left town to go to college. The family would return from chapel before dawn, after a carol service, where the Stafford home was the centre of a neighbourhood celebration. Rathangan was too small to have a public house, so the largest house in the village was the focal point of the community. Guests ate brown bread made from a mixture of barley and wheat, drank ale, and made merry. As the day went on, the guests made their way home, as Christmas dinner was for the household. It was a feast of bacon, roast beef, boiled beef, ducks, chickens, pullets, and turkeys. In an echo of the Roman Saturnalia, the servants would eat alongside the family with none of the usual distinctions. The rest of the evening was, as Monsignor Stafford puts it, devoted to mirth and brown ale. The following day, St. Stephen's Day, the young man would go down to the field beside the church to watch the mummers. Mummering is now a proud tradition in places as far afield as Newfoundland in Canada and Philadelphia in America, but Monsignor Stafford's description proves the belief that this was brought to these places by Irish immigrants. In fact, Newfoundland specifically saw large numbers of people move there from Wexford right around the time that he is talking about. Mummering involves young men dressing in fantastical costumes, sometimes with masks and festooned with ribbons. In his description, they would first put on a public performance and then go from house to house. There they would engage in clownish antics. He describes them presenting his father with, quote, a dish of ashes for stirabout and then sticking a live coal in it as a substitute for butter. Other guests would drop by throughout the day, and the old black oak table groaned with the weight of the feasts. St. Stephen's Day is also when Ireland's modern mummers come out to play, just as they did back in Monsignor Stafford's time. But the modern Irish tradition is quite different from what he describes. While in Newfoundland, for example, the mummers still simply act as clowns, in Ireland the wren boys took their place. Up until the middle of the 20th century, groups of boys and young men would put on fantastical mummers' costumes and go hunting wrens. They would drive them out of bushes and throw stones at them. When someone managed to kill one, they would put it in a specially constructed ball of holly and ivy on the end of a pole, and then parade around town collecting money for the wren's funeral. This would be used to host a party, the wren's wake. In Kerry they were accompanied by Lair Ban, the white mare. This was a hobby horse, a man playing the role of a ghostly horse. He would be covered in a sheet, with a horse's skull on a stick for a head, usually with decorations hanging from it. Why they targeted a wren is not actually known, though there are many legends. The most common is that one betrayed St. Stephen as he was hiding. St. Stephen was the first Christian martyr. He was murdered by a crowd he was preaching to. So that's rubbish. Another is that a wren's chattering spoiled an Irish ambush on Cromwell's forces. But the wren hunt goes back over a millennia before Cromwell. One bizarre theory is that it was actually about Christian persecution of paganism. The wren is a symbol of druidic practices. This seems unlikely, to say the least. My personal favourite is that it's because of the fairy Queen Cleona. She was a queen of the Tuatha De Danann and the goddess of County Cork. Sadly, little of her legends survive, as the monster myths weren't as much recorded by the early monks. According to some legends, Cleona had taken to drawing mortals down to the seashore with magic and drowning them. A young man found a charm against her that broke her power, and she fled in the form of a wren. So the wren boys are trying to kill or capture the fallen goddess. This is also unlikely to be the original reason for the hunt, but it's a fun story. As Ireland became increasingly Catholic in the 1950s, the more pagan folk traditions were suppressed, and most forms of mummering went by the wayside. But the wren hunt survived in County Kerry, became well known in more recent decades as a tourist attraction. They don't hunt a real wren anymore, of course, and haven't for some time. Even back in the heyday of mummering, some groups would settle for a model of a wren, and nowadays that's what they use. It always makes for a fun story on the evening news during those slow Christmas days. And Senior Stafford made it home for Christmas, but one woman writing a century later was not so lucky. In 1926, Annie Smithson from Dublin wrote about spending one Christmas up in Donegal as a district nurse in the years before World War I. She says she was living in Gallenmore, which doesn't seem to be on the maps anymore, and neither is Glenkillam, the nearest village with a church. She mentions the nearest big town being Hillenbeg, which might be her misremembering the name of Killybegs. It's not surprising that Annie might be mistaken in the names, as she had the traditional Dubliner's slightly patronising attitude to Donegal, which was about as remote a corner of Ireland as you could get back then. Despite that, she does seem to have been fond of the locals, especially the old ladies sitting by their turf fires, who made up the bulk of her circuit. She was less impressed by the young ladies, who she saw as obsessed with fashion. Annie was especially annoyed by them spending their money to order poor quality blouses from England, while they themselves were making hand-embroidered blouses that would be sold for many times the cost in shops in Dublin and Belfast. When she asked one girl why she didn't just make her own blouses, she was told it would be too common. Annie herself was the subject of local astonishment for an English tradition she imported, putting up a Christmas tree. The children especially were fascinated, and she had to invite them all to come to see it on St. Stephen's Day. Before that, she had to get through Christmas itself. Christmas Eve was a double trial. First a sick call up one of the highest hills nearby, which took up most of the day, and then coming back to the nurse's house to letters from her family that left her very homesick for Dublin. The next day she was up before dawn for a 2-hour journey to Belah for the morning mass. This was a mixture of cycling where she could and walking where she couldn't. At least the wind was at her back as she left, though it was uphill for several miles and she had to walk at first. As it flattened out and she was able to ride her bicycle, she recalls hearing, inexplicably, the sound of a peal of bells ringing out. Not a single church bell, as many churches in Donegal had, but a proper chorus of tuned bells playing music. Annie would have been familiar with the pealing of Christ Church Cathedral and St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. She was right to be astonished, though. The closest church with a peal of bells would have been in Ballymena, over 100 miles away. The heavenly music continued to sound until she reached the outskirts of Belah, and it was replaced by the single bell of the local church, calling her to Mass. After Mass, she was invited to breakfast by the priest's housekeeper, Mrs. Mulligan, and she attended a second Mass before setting out on the return journey. It was storming by now, and she was soaked to the skin by the time she made it the 10 miles back to Gallenmore 3 hours later. The rest of Christmas was spent by the fire, reading the Christmas magazine she'd been sent from Dublin, and dreaming of home. I'd like to close out this Christmas episode by talking about an old Irish tradition that's very close to my heart. I grew up in Donegal, quite some time after Nurse Smithson's sojourn in the county, and the trip out to Mass was by car and not bicycle. Monsignor Stafford would be glad to know that the tradition of midnight Mass had returned by then, as he lamented it ending in Wexford 2 centuries before. Another tradition for the night of Christmas Eve, meticulously observed in my family, was to put a candle in the window of the front room. Traditionally, this was supposed to be signifying that, unlike in Bethlehem, Mary and Joseph would find a welcome here. In the days before electricity, it also served the practical purpose of guiding late-night visitors to a friendly hearth on the darkest night of the year. Allegedly, it also served to guide priests going house to house to conduct a covert Christmas Mass during the era of the penal laws. But it also has a deeper and more personal significance for many Irish families. Emigration has been a major factor in Irish life since the 17th century, with many young people leaving Ireland in search of a better life, never to return. Candle in the window was a cry out to those who had gone away, letting them know that the Christmas hearth was still warm for them. Of course, in the modern age of jet travel, those young people who have gone abroad and not set down roots too strong will take up that welcome and come home for Christmas. In fact, for many of them, Christmas is the only time of the year they are able to come home. This is why St. Stephen's Night, the night after Christmas, has such significance for them. For young people who grow up together and then scatter to the winds, St. Stephen's Night is when they can meet up again and recapture their youth. Christmas is for your family, and Stephen's Night is for your friends, and the pubs and nightclubs all across Ireland are packed up with people celebrating their reunion. Whether you're able to celebrate your Christmas by a warm fire with your family like Monsignor Stafford, or you're left dreaming of home like Annie Smithson, I hope you have a good one. From me to you, from ours to yours, Nulla Ditch, and a Happy New Year as well. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. If you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.